Welcome to Please Leave Podcast, where you'll hear truly scary stories that you cannot get out of your head. These stories may contain graphic depictions of violence or explicit language. Listener discretion is advised.
I stare down at my phone, frozen in wonder and in horror. Fear's icy fingers curl tight around my racing heart, and the hair on the back of my neck bristles in a shiver of terror. It had all led to this, I realize now. To this moment. My brother Frank died. That was the start, I suppose. He wasn't old. And he was ill, but not in a circling the drain kind of way, more in a slowly descending deeper and deeper into disability kind of way. He was 48 when he died, but he was sick a long time. He'd been going back and forth to the doctors since his late teens, but they just kept telling him he was overweight. That, according to them, was the root of all my brother's issues. He was perfectly healthy, they'd say, except for the fact that he was overweight. Even very healthy for an overweight person. Something he was proud of. Until suddenly he wasn't healthy anymore. None of them thought to see the weight as a symptom rather than a disease, and by the time one finally bothered to look for metabolic causes, it was all too late. Sometime back in his teens, his immune system, confused by some other virus, had mistaken his thyroid for an invader and started trying to destroy it. As his metabolism faltered, his adrenal glands flooded his system and gradually burned themselves out trying to take over the thyroid's job. His pancreas struggled to maintain balance with the adrenaline lurches until his tissues stopped responding to its messages. He became diabetic, and his cholesterol levels and blood pressure began to climb. Inflammation burned out of control and spread to every cell in his body. His hormonal system disintegrated into complete disarray. His bones weakened, his joints wore out. Even small wounds took months to heal, and he seemed to catch every virus he encountered. His spine was wrecked, his knees were shot, both his hips and his ankles had started to give up too by the end. He wasn't a wheelchair user, but he did use a cane whenever he went out. Against that backdrop, it sounds silly, but it's still true. He died suddenly. He was on a ton of medication, and he had a laundry list of diagnosed health issues, but he was in no way expected to die. Apparently, he had liver failure, and that led to the heart attack. That's what the autopsy concluded anyway. He didn't drink, my brother, so it must have been non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, they said. It was apparently secondary to his metabolic disease and high cholesterol, which were probably secondary to his adrenal problems, which were most likely secondary to his thyroid issues. Almost everything wrong with Frankie was secondary to the primary doctor who saw him when he was 18 and told him to take up a sport. His neighbor had found him, saw him through the window and shoved the door in. Called for help. Tried to start CPR, but rigor had already locked his mouth shut. Anyway, this isn't about that. Not really. Our sister is the one who first told me. Not about him dying. Our dad told me that. Poor guy. But my sister told me about this. She's always been the most proactive one. She's the eldest, you know. I'm the youngest. She called me in quite casually in the middle of another rambling conversation about what we're doing and how our lives are going. She just came out with it. You know Frankie's on Streetview? Took me a second to compute what she'd said. What? I asked. On Google, on Streetview. If you go to his street, he's there. He's at the window doing dishes. Oh, I replied. What could I say to that? He'd been dead about a year. How'd you find that out? I don't know, she replied, still casual. I just went and looked, and there he was, sitting there, doing dishes. The conversation moved on, and we didn't talk about it again. By the end of the phone call, I'd basically forgotten she'd even said it. So it was another 6 months before I looked for myself. There was a YouTube video one of my kids was watching. 10 creepiest things on Google Maps. I came in halfway through. A body on a glacier, which was either a 25-foot-tall human or a shadow. A bunch of dolls of dead people in a village, which were created by a talented and increasingly lonely local artist. A stain purporting to be blood from a drive-by shooting. Honestly, it could have been blood, or Dr. Pepper, or chocolate milkshake. I didn't see the rest. My kid never watches a whole video, and at that moment he lost interest and jumped to something else. But it reminded me. I took out my phone and opened the Maps app, typed in my brother's old address, and then jumped out to Streetview. I tapped along the street a couple of times, then rotated the view towards his house. And there he was, at the window, doing dishes. He looked like a ghost already in the picture, an irony which was not lost on me. The house across the street was reflected on the window in front of him, and he was pale and insubstantial behind it. He could have been anyone. I mean, I knew it was him, because I know my brother's face. But in a lineup, a stranger would never pick him out. He was just a fuzzy digital ghost. I zoomed in and double-tapped on my phone, taking a screenshot. For a long moment, I just looked at his face. His expression was blank. He was staring dead ahead out the window, contemplating a view I couldn't see. Maybe he wasn't doing dishes, I thought. But he was at his sink. That was where he sat on a wheeled stool to do dishes. He'd lived in a tiny one-bedroom row home, purpose-built for a disabled person, with ramp access and an accessible bathroom. He'd been placed there by the local authority when he got too ill to work. It's in the nearest small town from where I live, only about 15 miles away, but I don't go often. I didn't go often. I'd not been to his place since the week after he died, when my siblings and I boxed up and removed all his stuff so that the new tenant could move in. Before that, I'd rarely been more than once every couple of years. I wouldn't say that we didn't get along. That would suggest friction or a fight. There wasn't that. There just wasn't anything much. We weren't close. We're a big family, 6 kids, and he wasn't very close to any of us. Well, he'd been close to our mother, but in a way that apparently made helping to care for her when she got ill too hard for him. Also in a way that made him think when she died that his grief was different to ours. That in the suffering Olympics he had won gold, and that we could never understand the depth of his pain, ours being so shallow in comparison. I guess that's what left us not close, really. Her dying. The way we pulled together and he pulled away. But that's not to say there was tension. There wasn't. There just wasn't much feeling of any sort. We'd say love you at the close of phone calls or when we parted ways after one of our meetups. Mom used to say love is a verb. The love between my brother and I was definitely more of a noun by the time he died. It hadn't always been like that. He was much older than me. By the time I was born, he was worrying about acne and looking forward to getting his driver's license. But he'd liked having a new baby around. Enjoyed the hero worship he was given by my toddler self. Back then, he was my favorite person in the whole world. and especially at Christmas. It was weird. I mean, people thought it was weird. A teenage boy, then a young man, so obsessed with Christmas. But he was. Everyone came over for Christmas back then, too. Back when Mom was still well and hosting a huge Christmas Day feast and party. He lived with us into his mid-20s, but even after he'd moved out, Frankie always came home early to decorate and to run through all our traditions, mine and his, that he'd invented for me over the years. On the 1st of December, he'd come home, and he and I would go to the store and buy tons of crepe paper, tinsel, and baubles. Then we'd come home and heave the rest of our festive hoard down from the attic and begin our sparkly campaign of wonder. Every room would be liberally festooned. At the time, I thought it was the height of festive style, the most beautiful, exciting, enchanting look. In retrospect, it was like Santa and all his elves had had a bachelor party and the reindeer had shat glitter everywhere. Then on Christmas Eve, he'd be back. The rest of the siblings who lived far enough away they needed to stay over would arrive, and Frankie would produce new matching pajamas for us. Sometimes for all of us, sometimes when most of the older ones started having kids and stopped staying over, just for me and him. In the late afternoon of Christmas Eve, when the sky had streaked pink and begun to darken, we'd put on our new pajamas, snuggle under a blanket on the sofa, and we'd put on the first of our 3 Christmas favorites, Santa Claus the movie. We'd open our Cokes when Joe opened his, cheer when the super-duper looper saved Patch, and bite our candy canes when the evil BZ bites his and floats off into the sky. Afterwards, we'd make toffee popcorn together, adding extra butter and salt and licking our fingers. Then put on the Muppets Christmas Carol. We'd sing every word. I can still sing every word. Then we'd put on It's a Wonderful Life, and invariably I'd fall asleep and Frankie would carry me up to bed. I don't think I saw that movie all the way through until I was about 12. On Christmas Day, Frankie helped Mom cook and always had 2 or 3 new recipes he wanted to try each year. Cranberry-studded red cabbage, carrots cooked in orange juice and tossed in butter and marmalade, leg of lamb studded with garlic cloves. On Boxing Day, he'd make leftover feasts. Turkey curry, bubble and squeak, the most enormous tower sandwiches, 3 layers of cold roast meats, mayo, stuffing, and whatever leftover vegetables he thought would go. When I was about 16, he got a job far away, too far for him to come home like this for Christmas, and our traditions slowly faded or morphed. Then Mom got ill and died. And when I emerged from the fog of grief that shrouded the year following her death, I was pregnant. It didn't work anymore, the dynamic between Frankie and I once I was grown up, especially once I was a parent. He wanted me to be the excited, wide-eyed kid, and I couldn't be that for him. In a way, I suppose I felt abandoned by him, that I'd had to do such sudden, painful growing up, and he wanted to ignore it, treat me like I was still 8. But some of our Christmas traditions stuck. He didn't know, but when he died, every year I sit down with my kids on Christmas Eve for hot chocolate and popcorn and the Muppets Christmas Carol. I considered his blank face looking up from my phone, stroked it gently with my fingertip, then closed the app, turned the screen off. Weeks went by before I looked again. I'd been at work having a coffee break on a Friday, and someone was talking about how their friend couldn't stop calling their recently deceased mother's phone, listening to her voice on the answering machine, leaving messages. There were about 10 of us sitting around nursing mugs. Everyone had different thoughts on this. Some thought it was only natural, others thought it was ghoulish. One said that the digital age meant that people no longer really died, because we all had ongoing access to video and audio of those we lost. "My brother's on Streetview," I said. My dead brother, I mean. There was a silence, slightly awkward from the people who'd been saying things were ghoulish, but then Fiona, the PA, my work bestie, leaned forward, very interested. "What? Show us," she said. Anne, reception, dug her in the ribs with an elbow, but Fiona just shrugged her away and went on looking at me expectantly. I took out my phone and brought up my brother's old address, then zoomed in on his window and held my phone up to show them all. "It's pretty blurry," I said. "I guess it could be anyone, but it's Frankie at his kitchen window." "Whoa," Fiona sat back in her chair. "That's wild. Are you okay with it? I mean, isn't that weird?" I shrugged. "I suppose," I said, turning it back to look at my brother's ghostly image. "This is only the second time I've looked. My sister, the oldest one, she told me he was on there." "Is it like looking back in time?" asked Catriona. "Accounts?" "A bit," I said, considering. "It's more weird to think of when I'm using maps for something else. I looked up Stockholm the other day because my dad's going there in the spring, and I was using Streetview to look at the hotels he's considering. And it suddenly occurred to me, that all these people walking down the streets with their faces blurred could actually be dead and gone." There was a silence again, then, and I looked down at my brother's shadowy face. Someone muttered, "Ghoulish," again. But I didn't see who because I was too busy looking at the picture, squinting in puzzlement at it. It was different. Or was it? Had he always been holding that red mug? It might seem unbelievable now, but I didn't immediately check. The boss wandered around and casually sat at her desk and turned her monitor back on, indicating to the rest of us that coffee time was over. We collectively wheeled our chairs back to our desks and got back to work, finishing up for the weekend. By the time I got home, it had slipped my mind again. It was the start of December, and the kids all came home from school full of festive cheer, and after much begging and persuasion on their end, we spent the weekend buying new Christmas decorations, putting up the tree, and adorning the house. But not to Frankie's standards, because I did develop some taste as I matured. It was late on Sunday evening when I looked again. I'd been drinking tea out of the red mug which I had brought home after we'd cleared the little house. It reminded me. So I went to look, but when I did, he wasn't holding the mug in the Streetview picture. I must have imagined it. He was just sitting, staring out of the window, possibly, presumably, doing his dishes. I stared at him for a long time. Was he in a slightly different place? Get a grip of yourself, I thought. He's dead. It's a photo. He's not moving around. But still, I didn't think he'd been over toward the edge of the window. I had a sudden epiphany and double-tapped, took a screenshot, then opened another app and hunted through my gallery for the last photo. And I put them side by side. He had moved. Only a tiny bit. His head was a few inches further to the right, as if he'd rolled his stool over a few inches. How weird, I thought. That's seriously creepy. I saved the comparison pic and sent it to my sister with a comment attached. Is it just me, or is Frankie rolling around his kitchen still? I stared for a while at the 2 gray check marks, but then a kid yelled from upstairs and I put my phone down and went to see what was wrong. It was even later when she answered, when I was in bed myself. Bit creepy. They must upload different stills from the same video periodically. Or maybe you're a click or two further down the road than when you last looked. I considered this. It made sense. He was probably moving when they drove by, and I'm looking from when the car recording was in a slightly different spot. It still kind of gave me the creeps, though. I next looked on Christmas Day. It had been our second Christmas without Frankie, but somehow that hit harder than the first year. I guess the first year we were all ready for it, ready to miss him, ready for the pain, for the space at the table. But between the first and the second Christmases, 2 other brothers brought new twin nieces and a new nephew to the table. Even though they more than took up the space Frankie had left empty, somehow there being 3 new little people he'd never met, would never meet, really got to me. And then there was the discussion, in which our dad told us all how he'd been feeling for nearly 2 years. The old house was too much for him. He wanted to sell it and move to an apartment in town, in a retirement complex, where 2 of his oldest friends, also widowed, had moved. He'd wanted to say something earlier, he said, but Frankie died and he didn't want to take this big gathering away from us then. I always hosted, you see, at Dad's. That's how it had been since Mom died. The older ones had begun having babies before she died and didn't have the space or the energy. And I was at Dad's a lot, being back and forth from college still. So I took it on. I dug out Mom's old recipes, dragged Dad to the grocery store to get all the food, and we'd put on our paper hats and smiles and made Christmas happen. It seemed natural, in a way, me hosting with Dad at the old family home. It was something Mom's death couldn't take from us if I carried it on. And Frankie came. Once he'd moved into the little house nearby, he came every year again. But it wasn't like it used to be. He didn't stay over, he didn't cook, he didn't decorate. When I tried to ask him about it, he just said he missed Mom, that it wasn't the same without her. That annoyed me. It wasn't the same for me either, but I did it because someone had to. I didn't want to be annoyed at Christmas, so I just dropped it. Now I found myself 14 years, a husband, and 3 kids later since Mom died, and I still did it. But this year, it seemed, would be the last. Dad was determined to sell. Nobody else had a space big enough to host the 5 siblings, their spouses, and the 11 kids we'd collectively added to the clan so far, plus various in-law relatives that sometimes came. I was both relieved and saddened. It was an unbelievable amount of work nowadays, with so many to feed and entertain, and Dad less and less able to help. But also it felt like a defeat, the relinquishing of something. So I was back in my own home at last, prostrate on the sofa with very mixed feelings and a long-awaited and hard-earned glass of wine. And Ben was putting the kids to bed. I was thinking about Frankie and how in such a short time everything was moving on without him. I was draining the wine right as the image refreshed, right as I turned the view in front of his house, and I almost choked. He'd turned his head. He was looking right at the camera. Right at me. I threw the phone, not dramatically, not across the room or anything, just onto the floor. Ben, hearing it hit the carpet as he was coming down the stairs, came in to ask what was wrong. All I could do was sob and say, "Frankie." "Frank." Ben frowned and took out his phone. Wrapping one arm around me, he opened the app and went to look for himself. I turned my face away. I couldn't bear to see him again, the dark hollows of his eyes looking at me through the screen. "Wow," Ben breathed. "There he is." He paused a while, then, "Hey, he's doing the dishes." "He was," I whispered. "Now he's looking right at me, at the camera." "What?" Ben tilted his head at me. "No, he's not. Look, hey, look. He's just doing the dishes." I looked, and there was my brother. My dead brother, sitting at his window, staring into space, doing his dishes. Ben had led me up to bed. "You're just exhausted," he'd said. "It's a lot, your whole family to cook for. And it's sad missing family at Christmas, especially Frankie, with how he was about Christmas, and you've had wine, and you hardly ever have wine." And I agreed with him because, after all, I'd seen what he saw too. Frankie at the window doing his dishes. It was the middle of February when I next looked. That was how long it took for me to work my nerve up again, because even though I agreed with Ben that he was just doing his dishes, a tiny part of me was scared. Scared I'd look and see him again, staring right at me. But when I finally did look, it was worse. Because when I looked in February, Frankie was gone. I stared for a few seconds at his empty window, my own breath loud in my ears, my heart quickening. "What? Oh, God, there was a sinking feeling in my gut. They've re-recorded it, I thought. They've updated the video. Well, I realized they must do that intermittently. It was bound to happen eventually. I looked at the empty window until it had sunk in. That Frankie was gone. I rotated the view back to the street and saw something weird. His car was still there. His tiny, navy blue, beat-up old car still parked across the road from his house. What? It had been towed for scrap the same day we emptied his house. This couldn't be a new video. I tapped again, working my way down the street. When I'd worked my way about 3 doors down, I began to rotate to look back up the street towards Frankie's house. And as I was facing the house, I saw him. There was Frankie in the window, doing dishes. What the fuck? I jumped back onto maps, double-checking. That definitely wasn't his house. That was his neighbor's house. What was his name? Jim. Nice old guy, deaf as a post. I jumped back to the street view, and Frankie was still there. Still, apparently, doing dishes, but in the wrong house. I took another screenshot, made another comparison composite, but it wasn't all that helpful. The houses were more or less identical. Yes, it was Jim's house, with a different colored railing on the ramp, different flowers in the window box, but it was so similar. I sent it to my sister again, with no message, only 2 question marks. 2 question marks what? I know, I told you he was there. Look again. Wrong house. Either Streetview is glitching or your brain is. Are you okay? I'm fine. I just noticed it. Thought it was weird. Computers. They're amazing until they're not. I'm sure it's just a glitch. How are your littles? Mine are moaning about exams. We switched to talking about the kids, and that was that. But it nagged at me, Frankie being in the wrong house. In April, I saw him again, but completely unexpectedly. In March, my sister had messaged me to say they'd re-recorded the town, which she knew because Frankie and his car were gone. I'd gone and looked, and sure enough, his window, with freshly painted sills and a new flowering vine climbing the wall beside it, was empty. I'd felt sad, bereft almost. Only for a day or so, but quite deeply. It had only been a picture. It was just a snapshot of the past, but it had been my brother, and he'd been there. I'd been able to go and visit him when I wanted, albeit in this unreal digital sense, and now I couldn't. But by April, I'd gotten over it, gone back to missing him in the more general, less acute way, when my friend sent me a link to an ad for a house that she was thinking of putting an offer in on. It was on a street I'd never been down, so after reading the ad, I'd clicked on the maps link to go and have a nosy little peek. I'd jumped to the street view and moved it up and down the street until I found the right one. It was a nice house, 4-bedroom duplex, quite new, with a single attached garage and a brick-paved driveway. I'd moved around a bit, examining it from slightly different angles, and then with a completely accidental, random click, I rotated to face the road. And my breath caught in my chest, compressed there by a squeeze of alarm and disbelief. Because there was Frankie. His little dark blue car was coming towards the camera. His face and license plate were blurred, of course, but it was him. Crammed behind the wheel in his typical driving posture, that of a Goliath of a man poured into a tiny compact car. His ancient green winter coat was creased tight across his substantial shoulders. A wool knit hat was visible on the unblurred part of his head. I'd knitted that hat. My heart was racing. What the fuck was he doing there? Okay, be rational. He must have gone out, I thought. The day they went past his house, he must have gone out, and they've not refreshed this part of town yet. That must be it. I examined the picture. It was a winter scene. The road was wet, the trees were bare, and other blurred humans could be seen bundled up in heavy coats, hats, and scarves on the pavement. But surely, I rotated back to the house, which was bathed in sunlight. Cherry blossom lay scattered on the lawn, cast by the neighbor's tree. Had they stitched all these images together, I thought, old and new all mixed up? I'd rotated back to the road again then. but the little blue car was gone. That made me a bit crazy, to be honest, for a while. After that, I looked for him. Every day, multiple times a day, I'd open the app and click around. At first, I was methodical, starting at his house and working my way out, then going to the street he was driving on and working my way towards his house, then trying to work out his routes to supermarkets, the doctors, his favorite cafe. But I couldn't find him. And after a few weeks without success, I just began randomly clicking all over the map, jumping along down strange streets, looking up at random windows. And when that didn't work, I began looking in other towns, places he'd worked, visited, lived, places we'd vacationed in when I was little. Then just random places. Anywhere on Earth. Down alleyways in distant South American cities, either side of roads that stretched through endless Australian deserts, along the base of a volcano in Iceland. Of course, I couldn't find him. I found other tallish fat guys. I saw hundreds of little navy blue cars. I even saw a similar knitted hat on a tiny old woman in a village in Korea. But not Frankie. Not my brother. I finally stopped myself looking by telling Ben about it. He was lovely. Hugged me and listened and looked at the pictures with a polite glance and then said gently, "Frankie is dead. And even if he's on the internet, he's still dead." Which is what I knew he'd say. Is why I told him. And when I'd stopped crying and the urge to look struck again, not even an hour later, I told myself, Frankie's dead, and even if he's on the internet, he's dead. And I left my phone where it was. It was the first week of June when I'd repeated Ben's accidental mantra to stop myself from picking up my phone for the first time. It worked. And it worked for a good while. Months. At first I was a bit frantic, wanting to look, arguing with myself. But then it was like the madness I was in melted away and I came to my senses. Realized how ridiculous it had been, clicking all over the world looking for a dead man. By November, it felt like we were almost a different people, current me and the older version of me who had acted that way. Some crazy past edition of myself I'd moved way beyond. It was kind of the same situation as the last time, the next time. Someone I knew from the school pickup line was planning to walk a bit of the moors near where I lived. Well, not very near, but the moors are so empty that where I live can be the nearest place for miles. Anyway, she was planning to walk with her dogs, but one was a puppy who was too young to manage the full distance. She had asked me for ideas on where her other half could meet them somewhere along the way to pick the puppy up. I had the satellite map up on my laptop, looking for places you could park a car. Meanwhile, I was using my phone to look at the Streetview, to see if the extra-wide passing place was actually a bit of a roadside bog, or the convenient driveway entrance had a gate across it. And I remember how it felt, that it had been long enough that using maps didn't remind me of it. Of Frankie. Seeing him. Enough time had passed of me not using it at all and then only using it to navigate that it didn't feel like going back there. To the madness of it. There weren't many roads to choose from. She'd planned an awkward route, to be honest, but I kept looking. I saw in the satellite view an old building with a short driveway that led from a tiny single-lane road. The road was too narrow to just stop, but maybe there'd be enough space there to pull in and wait. I found it on my phone and I clicked on it, jumping out to Streetview. There was no gate on the driveway. So far, so good. I'd rotated the view towards the building. It was an old farming building of some sort, long and low, made of local stone and with corrugated roof panels. Some asbestos, overgrown with moss, others steel, rusted away and full of holes. There was a small space in front of it, big enough to wait, to turn a car. I'd turned the view again. Frankie was there. He was leaning against the nearest corner of the building, facing the camera, hunched as if against the cold, hands stuffed down into his pockets. His face wasn't blurred. Streetview isn't taken at an amazingly sharp resolution. I won't pretend I could see every detail of his features, but I could see enough. The colors were odd. The image was from dusk, I suppose. The fading light gave his skin a greenish-grayish tinge. Rage was etched deep in the shadows around his small, deep-set eyes, which were hidden almost completely in shadow. His mouth turned down, lined like an old ventriloquist's puppet in an angry scowl. A sharp crease bisected his brow. He glared out at me. A sensation of cold swept across my scalp as fear tightened my skin. And my fingers spasmed and jerked so that I dropped my phone. It clattered on the edge of the table and tumbled screen down onto the floor. I just stared at it, fighting to get a breath into my lungs. I wasn't frightened of Frankie in life, but to strangers he was an imposing man. He was 6'4" and probably 300 pounds. And we're a neurodiverse sort of family, so he wasn't a very animated man. He had a narrow range of facial expressions that could leave people feeling he was disinterested, or arrogant, or depressed. If you knew him, you could tell his mood from the tone of his voice, the way his hands moved as he spoke. He was a funny and gentle man, but if you didn't know him, he came across at first as morose, even threatening. And on the little screen, his face twisted in wrath, he looked almost monstrous. I was trembling, both at the shock of seeing him and at his expression. My mind was a blank void of shock and fear, like the silence after an explosion. I couldn't think. I just sat, panting, wrestling with what I'd seen, trying to convince myself I'd not really seen it. Eventually, I began to come to my senses and leaned down and cautiously picked up my phone. The screen had turned off, and I was too scared to turn it on again. I looked back at the laptop and steeled myself. I'd look there on the bigger screen. It was probably just a grumpy farmer leaning there, I told myself, unimpressed by the camera car crawling through his land. I used the mouse to carefully open the street view. I squeezed my eyes shut as I clicked to rotate the view, feeling sick, fear an icy knot in my middle. When I opened my eyes, the knot tightened. There he was. But he had his back to the camera now. He was in the same posture, hunched, but facing the other way, so no part of his face was visible. Was it Frankie? I was certain it was. But when I imagined myself showing Ben, I could almost hear his voice. That's just a man. That could be anyone. You can't even see their face. Had I imagined it all? I was losing it. This was ridiculous. I clicked back out of the street view and stared at the satellite image for a second. This Frankie, I noted with a shiver, was staring across the moor, away from the camera, but towards my house. I told Ben. I can always rely on Ben. He's never unkind or dismissive, but he brings me quickly and firmly back to sanity. This time, he mulled it over for a while and then suggested I have some grief counseling. Not because there's anything wrong, he said, just as a sort of checkup. Because it's happened a few times now, this getting caught up online trying to find Frankie, thinking you found Frankie. Maybe a professional can help. We found a lovely therapist named Sandra. She said it was common. Not the street view thing, but seeing a deceased loved one. She had me think about it in relation to Mom. Walked me through. And I did, I remembered. Chasing the tall woman with the walking stick in the supermarket. Seeing her driven past engrossed in a novel on the number 28 bus. being positive it was her sitting in the bingo hall, her eyes down on her cards for the game. "See," Sandra had said, "it's not a Frankie thing. It's a grief thing. And it will pass." She gave me some exercises to do when the urge to look for him struck, or when I thought I saw him. And I should be doing them this second. I should be. But I can't, because my blood is slush in my veins and my heart is trying to bash its way out of my chest, and I can't take my eyes off my phone screen. It never sat right with me, the "it's not a Frankie thing" theory, because the thing about seeing my mom was it wasn't her. That woman I chased through the supermarket and into the parking lot was about 10 years too old. I was still behind the number 28 bus when the woman with the novel got off, and she was a good foot too short. And my mother wouldn't have been seen, even dead, in a bingo hall. That was the thing about seeing my mom. It wasn't my mom. The illusion was only ever for a few seconds, a moment. The spell always broke. Frankie was different. It was him. In his window, in his neighbor's window, in his car. Yes, leaning against that old, ruined building, too. That last one I wasn't sure about, but I am now. It's Christmas Eve. The big old house sold in August. Dad is going to my sister's tomorrow. My brothers have all made their own arrangements, and for the first time ever, it'll be just us. Ben and me and the kids, here in my house for Christmas. I've prepped far too much food. After more than a decade of cooking for a small army of people, I've completely misjudged how much 5 will need. It's what I was doing. Peeling and chopping and wrapping stuff in bacon, getting all the advance work done so that in the morning I can watch the kids open their gifts and not have to keep running to the kitchen. They're out, Ben and the kids. He took them to the care home to visit his mom, who doesn't really know who any of them are anymore, but still loves unwrapping gifts with them. Afterwards, he was going to stop by the little Christmas market in the town so the kids can have churros with chocolate sauce and warm alcohol-free mulled wine and look at the lights. It's dark outside. The sun went down around 4, and it's near 7 now. It's why I did it, why I looked. I opened maps because the eldest has her phone with her, and through it I can see her location on maps. I was going to make hot chocolate, and I thought, I'll look, see if they're on their way back yet, surprise them with it when they walk in. Hot chocolate, popcorn, the Muppets Christmas Carol. So I opened maps, but when I went to pinch out, to see where they might be, with wet, slippery, just-rinsed hands, I fumbled. I fumbled and hit the Streetview pick instead. You can see right into our kitchen on Streetview. I don't think I've ever looked at it before, at my own house. Right through my kitchen window. And through it, off to the left, you can see me, in my red Christmas sweater, standing with my back to the camera, the window, holding something. Holding my phone. Looking at my phone. Beside me, you can see the bowl of vegetable peelings that's on the table in front of me. The giant tub of hot chocolate powder I've just taken out of the cupboard. It's me. It's now. And I'm standing here as frozen as the me in the image, unable to move, unable to breathe. Because you can also see on the street view the hulking figure of my dead brother standing right outside that window, inches from it, staring in, right behind me. I know I should be doing Sandra's exercises. As every hair on my body rises electrified, I know I should be breathing with intention, reminding myself of the facts. As I raise my head, sending prickling runs of shivers racing down my spine, I know I should be repeating the mantras we practiced together for this situation. I know I should be closing my eyes, visualizing the safe sandy beach we designed together, especially for me to escape to in my mind in just such a moment. But I don't. Instead, I turn stiffly and gulp back a cry as I find I am looking into the pale, mottled face of my brother. His sunken black eyes are wrinkled, deflated like little raisins pushed into the discolored dough of his face. His thinning, dirty blonde hair is pasted greasily flat to his skull. Blackened veins show dark through his waxy skin, snaking up across his cheeks and his temples. I imagine for a moment that it's a trick, a horrifying, cruel prank. Someone has dug him up, robbed him from his grave, and propped him there to terrorize me. Then he raises a blackened hand, palm out in our customary greeting. I take in his dark, shriveled fingertips, dirt-stained nails standing long beyond them. See the fingers curl each in turn in our little secret Mexican wave. A huge ball of terror and longing and revulsion and grief and love expands hot in my chest and geysers up my throat until the fire of it reaches my eyes and I begin to sob. Frankie has come home for Christmas.
This story was written by Bec Stranger and narrated by Kaye Weaver. For more scary stories that you cannot get out of your head, please join our Patreon at patreon.com/PleaseLeavePod. Please follow Please Leave on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Please Leave Pod. Our email is pleaseleavepod@gmail.com, and our website is pleaseleavepod.com. If you like our stories, please consider leaving us a review. It's just a couple of us getting this off the ground, and so your support really matters. This has been a Two Penguins Media production.
Quack.